Welcome to The Pilot Life, the show where we sit down with people who are passionate about aviation. My name is Brendan. I've been a commercial airline pilot for over 20 years, and in that time, I've heard some incredible stories. This is the show that I share those with you. Welcome on board. Welcome back, Pilot Lifers. As we like to say, another week, another pilot's living room and or kitchen in this case. Sitting across from my good friend, Cory Peters. How are you, sir?
We go a little ways back, don't we?
We do go a little ways back. I'm going to turn you up a little bit here. People may notice as they kind of follow this show now, as these first few episodes are like a little piece of my own aviation history. And I think you're probably the one that goes back deepest because we go back to
1998, I think.
1998. Yeah. Primary flight brief. Yep. Remember that?
Yep, I do. Yep. You were always my goal to try and beat, and you were just one step ahead of me the whole entire time through college.
Yes, well, thank you for saying that. Yeah, so we first met in brand new pilots working on our private pilot ratings.
Yeah, I think you soloed about 2 weeks before I did.
Okay.
Like it was really close.
Yeah, I soloed October 30th, 1998.
Yep, and I was November 11th.
A date that you will always remember, right?
Yep.
But let's step back a little further because I don't know much about your family history or where you're from or kind of like where this dream of flying first started.
Yeah. I grew up in Minnesota. I never thought I could be a pilot because I wear contact lenses now. I wore glasses as a kid, and I always thought, you have to have perfect vision to be a pilot. And so I just never thought I could be a pilot. My oldest brother was really into aviation and took me to some air shows when I was young, and loved everything about airplanes, but never really thought it was something I could attain. My life kind of changed a little bit too in high school. I started out high school, I wasn't in a really good place. My life really changed around through my church back in Minnesota, and I got involved doing youth ministry, youth mission trips, and those kind of things. And that's actually where I met my wife, Gwen, who's from Oregon. She was living out in Minneapolis working for this youth organization, and I was going on trips first as a student and then summer volunteer staff, and then joined their staff full time. Got married, we moved out to Oregon, still working with this youth organization. This is pre 9/11. This was 1997 timeframe. We're in the Portland airport, waiting for my sister-in-law to fly in, and I just felt like this wave come over me, like a calling almost to do commercial aviation. And it was an interesting dynamic because most people, once they're in the ministry, they kind of stay within the ministry. And I love this youth organization. In fact, all of my kids went on trips later on with this organization. Still have some friends who work with them. And so it wasn't like, we had any kind of disagreement or anything like that. It was really just feeling almost like a calling to go into aviation.
Had you done any flights prior? Had you gone up in any small airplanes or
one? Maybe less than a handful.
Okay.
I mean, it was. I think we went up with my neighbor when I was like 10.
Yeah.
And with my dad's cousin when I was like 8 or something like that. In fact, after that kind of emotional experience up in Portland, I thought, well, I should maybe check this out a little bit more.
Yeah.
So I did an introductory flight. I think they were like $19 at the time.
Yeah. Where at?
Albany.
Okay.
Yeah, Albany, Oregon. I went in, checked it out, and went, oh yeah, this is what I want to do.
Was that in a Cessna 152?
It was.
Okay.
Yep. So I just did an introductory flight with them, and then that fall started with Lane Community College in Eugene.
Okay. So you sign up for Lane, which is a 2-year program.
Yep.
And how did it go during flight training? How did you?
I loved Lane. I didn't know any different.
Yeah.
But I loved going through Lane. I loved the way their program was structured. Of course, it was in the old Eugene terminal building, and so it had all that history there. But I liked the diversity of classes as well. It wasn't just here's your aviation coursework, but things like being introduced to Ernest Gann, Fate is the Hunter, and some of these other classical aviation writers that I appreciated that about the program. It wasn't just here's the head knowledge of how to fly an airplane,
right?
But and we had a great we had a great class.
Yeah.
I mean, playing wiffle ball out by the the campus there, the aviation campus, and our summer picnics.
Yeah.
We just had a lot of fun.
Yeah. Why don't you talk to us about the brick drop during the summer picnic?
Yeah. Was that with you? Was it you and me in the?
I don't know if we were partners.
I don't think so.
But explain to the audience what the brick drop was.
So the whole picnic was just great. It was the end of season or end of school term picnic that we'd have. And I think we did it down in Cottage Grove Airport. We had different events, short takeoff and landing, and we're trying to win all these different things. And the brick drop, I think it was a sack of flour or something like that we used, and that was painted up like a brick, or maybe it was a styrofoam brick.
Yeah,
it was. It was a styrofoam brick. One person was on the runway with a box trying to catch this styrofoam brick.
That's right.
And the airport itself was at like 900 feet of elevation, and I think Bruce Gustafson said something like our hard deck altitude was, I think, 1,300 feet or something like that.
Yeah.
And whoever my partner was thought that was 1,300 feet above the ground. So we came in. We were miles.
So there was a pilot.
Yep.
And then there was
a dropper,
the bombardier. And then there was someone standing in the middle of the runway with a cardboard box to try to catch this brick.
Yeah. And I think ours floated down to Roseburg or something like that. It flew miles away.
Yeah, because you had to think about wind and everything. And so whoever went first really was at a disadvantage, right? Because you could see which way this little styrofoam brick would drop, and it would start going, and this person on the ground would just start sprinting across this runway.
They had the hardest job.
Yeah.
They had to chase down this styrofoam brick.
How did you do on the helicopter Buck and Bronco?
I think I last maybe a second and a half.
Yeah.
That was it. Yeah, that was one of the events where because Lane at that time had the helicopter program, which they don't anymore, but they would have a helicopter out there, and the instructor would talk you through, okay, here's, all you had was just the stick. That was it. And he would take his hands off, and that's when the timer would start. And the moment his hands came back down, it was over. And I think I got about a half a second before that helicopter starts to go crazy. And I think my record was like 1.2 seconds.
Because it's such a different skill set.
Totally.
Because airplanes, you physically move this control input, and helicopters, they would tell us all, just think, don't even actually move it, just think about moving it.
And I remember that from the briefing.
Yeah.
They said, okay, I'm going to show you how far to move that. Do you see it? And their hand didn't move,
right?
And here I am jerking that thing around, trying to stir it.
Instructor couldn't take it fast enough from us. I think I was the same thing. I was about like a second or two before the instructor grabbed it from me. It's my airplane, but then he would take us on a cool little.
That was fun.
He would take us on this low level. Yeah. We were just hauling down this little creek bed, and then he'd pull it straight up and do this little, whatever.
And I think he'd do an auto gyro into a landing. So that was a lot of fun.
Those were definitely the good old days.
Yeah.
What was your dream at the time? Did you have was your goal to get to the airlines? Was that what your goal was?
Yeah,
it was. Okay,
it was. Yeah, that was. I got that question a lot.
Yeah,
because having been in full-time missions work. A lot of our supporters, a lot of the people, the churches that we worked with, they just expected me to go into missions aviation as well.
Mm-hmm.
And, but the airlines were growing. It was, it was the late 90s. Everyone was hiring. 2 years I'm going to be working for this airline, and then 4 years I'm going to be working for the major airline. And, things were just ticking over so fast.
Yeah.
That, it was a good time to be starting
plans, right?
Yeah.
What could possibly go wrong in the aviation industry?
Yep.
LCC was a 2-year program, so you graduated with that program with?
We had the instrument and commercial, single engine.
Mm-hmm.
And one of our other classmates, John Lapine, he grew up in Minnesota as well, kind of splitting his time between the Seattle area and the Minnesota. Okay. And so he and I connected, of course, with the Minnesota connection. He heard about a school back in Minnesota that had a really good multi-engine program. And it was a 4-year university. At that time, you needed to have the 4-year bachelor's degree to get hired at any major airline. And so we decided to go out to Minnesota State University in Mankato and switch to a 4-year program.
Okay.
And that's when I started getting my multi-engine and flight instructor certificates and all that. The program at Mankato was in a bit of a transition as well. So John and I actually went to another place to finish up our CFI. And my very first day as a paid flight instructor with my CFI and CFII complete was 9/11, 2001.
Wow.
And I don't know if you remember or not, but they caught one of the terrorists in Minnesota who was trying to purchase some simulator time.
Oh, really?
Northwest Airlines. And because of that, they grounded all the flight schools in Minnesota, and the FBI was going around talking to all the different instructors saying, show us your student list. And of course, mine was pretty easy.
Right.
So I didn't have any students, but we were all grounded until we had our interviews.
Yeah.
So, and I was working for another airport. I wasn't working for the college. I was finishing my senior year of college while I was flight instructing at a different airport.
Where does this first airline gig come in?
One of the things I could do to finish my senior year was to take an unpaid internship with Atlantic Coast Airlines. ACA.
Wow.
Out in Washington, D.C.
Yeah.
At that time, you needed probably 1,500 to 2,000 hours at a minimum to be competitive to get hired on at a regional airline.
Okay.
So a lot of guys were flight instructing. You needed at least 300 to 500 hours of multi-engine time to get hired. So a lot of guys were flying canceled checks. And flying cargo and Aztecs and Barons and whatever you could, just to build some multi-engine time. And if I did this unpaid internship in Washington, D.C. for 4 months, number one, I could write a paper and use that to graduate my senior year. Then also I could get hired with only 750 hours total time.
With the airline?
With ACA.
ACA,
Yep.
okay.
And I think it dropped the minimums down to only 100 hours of multi-engine.
Okay.
And again, at that time, that was pretty significant.
It's funny the things we had to do for jobs back then, wasn't it?
Oh, man. Yeah, and so it was interesting. One of the other reasons why we moved back to Minnesota is, again, best laid plans.
Yeah.
When we decided to go into aviation and go back to college for aviation, I was married, and we had this great plan that Gwen was going to work a full-time job and I was going to work a part-time job, get through college debt-free. And then she got pregnant with with our oldest son. And I remember telling my dad, I don't even know how this happened. He's like, son, if you don't know by now, I'm not going to explain it. But it totally changed everything. So when we moved back to Minnesota, it was because Dannon was about 2 years old, I believe. Year and a half. He was a year and a half when we moved back to Minnesota. And my brothers were also starting families. So they had kids about the same age.
Yeah.
And then our first year back in Minnesota, we had our daughter.
Okay.
As well.
So did you leave the family to go to Washington, D.C. to do this unpaid internship?
Yep. It was worse than that. I moved him back home to Sweet Home, Oregon. So so Gwen moved in with her parents and our two little ones at the time. We didn't have our third son yet. Our third child, second son. And so they moved in with her parents in Sweet Home, Oregon. And I lived in Washington, D.C., and they lived here in Oregon for those 4 months.
And you weren't being paid out there?
Nope, not a bit.
Was that exciting for you, though, to be around around an airline? And they were flying jet streams, I think.
Yep,
right?
They were flying jet streams, and they were just starting to get CRJ 200s.
Yeah.
And they also flew the Dornier 328 jets. So they had about 30 of those, I believe. And yeah, I mean, it was... I will say, aside from the unpaid living in Washington, D.C. area, it was a really neat opportunity. There was a lot of other interns from all different universities. Of course, probably the two biggest were UND, University of North Dakota, and Embry-Riddle. It really gave you a great idea of what airline operations is from the top down.
Yeah.
I mean, you saw everything.
Was that then your first airline job? Did you get hired there?
Yep. So when you're done with your internship, you're invited to interview, and if you've done well with your internship, you're offered a first officer position. I want to say a week after I was offered a job as a first officer, they furloughed 120 people, and I think it was only about 6 months later before they went out of business. Might have been a year, but so I never actually made a paycheck at Atlantic Coast Airlines.
Wow.
It was technically my first airline job, but I never made any money.
Your first airline job and the company goes out of business.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yep.
Okay. So then where does the story go?
I'm broke, right?
Yeah.
I don't have any money. I just spent 4 months unpaid. And so one of my students when I was working in Minnesota as a flight instructor was a wonderful, wonderful man. He still owns a heating, venting, and air conditioning company that's specializes in very, very sensitive equipment. He had just gotten into aviation as a hobby and went and got his instrument rating at one of these 7-day or 10-day slap you through it, off you go, and you got your license. And wisely, he said, okay, I've got my instrument rating, but I need more experience.
Yeah.
And so he would hire me as an instructor to go along with him on some of his trips, just to teach him kind of just be there as a safety pilot more than anything. And so I went out to Minnesota August of 2003 and started flying for him.
So you're still just building time.
Yep.
Because the airlines have just started to hire again. Now we're post September 11th. So 2003 is when airlines are kind of starting to pick it back up again. Yeah.
Yeah.
And you get the call from who?
Mesaba.
Okay.
Mesaba Airlines. They were Northwest Airlines regional affiliate based out of Minneapolis.
And so what plane did you get hired onto?
The mighty Avro RG-85.
Is that what this is here?
Yep. It looks like a military cargo plane that didn't take its vitamins. I've been called C-17. Of course, when I was flying them in Europe, they call it the Jumbolino, the baby jumbo.
Okay.
It's some people say it's 5 APUs tied together by an electrical fault. It's built by British Aerospace and Engineering, BAE, and their older version of it was the 146.
Yeah.
And 4 small Lycoming made engines. Each one on the 146, each engine was, I think, 6,700 pounds of thrust.
Okay.
It bumped up to 7,000 pounds of thrust on the Avro, the later variant.
Okay.
But I was flying the Avro, so the more modernized version of the 146. 146 was, I think it officially came out in 1984. And in Europe, they'd fly them with 90 to 100 passengers. In the medium range version, the larger version had 110 passengers.
I see.
And it was a great airplane to fly. Very responsive, fun. The later variants, the Avro RJ85, which is the modernized version of it, that had a semi-glass cockpit, full auto throttle, had auto land capability. We didn't utilize the auto land capability at Mesaba because we just didn't fly in the fog that much. Our bases were Minneapolis, Detroit, Memphis.
I would assume when you get hired with Mesaba, the goal is build up my regional time, upgrade to captain on this regional jet, and then get hired with Northwest or something along those lines. Yeah,
having flown with so many people out here in Oregon, of course, a lot of people when they start their careers, they want to fly for they want to fly for Alaska. And I grew up in Minnesota, so I wanted to fly something with a red tail.
Yeah,
it's Northwest Orient, flying 747s to Tokyo from Minneapolis. Oh, that was the dream job, And in fact, the arrivals from Asia and from Alaska would fly right over the top of my house growing up. And so I remember seeing these red tail 747s flying over my house. They were probably about 10,000 feet up, but I remember that, seeing those things, thinking, that's what I want to do someday. So Mesaba at that time was flying for Northwest, and in 2005 the bankruptcy laws changed. So where previous to that change, you could have a company go bankrupt and the holding company was not held liable in any way. So Mesaba had a holding company, Mare Holdings, and they also owned another airline that they lost money on. But Mare Holdings had a whole bunch of money in the bank, but Mesaba didn't have any money in the bank. So Northwest missed a payment to Mesaba, and we didn't have any money in the bank, so we went bankrupt. So I was on year 2 pay when we went bankrupt, and they were demanding almost a 20% pay cut.
Wow.
And I remember sitting on our front porch. We owned a little farm cottage out in southern Minnesota. It's all we could afford. And I remember sitting out there. Gwen and I figured we had 1 day a month off at the same time. I was still working for Tom, flying. So I pick up an occasional corporate trip. And again, he treated me really well. So he kind of supported us during that time. But Gwen was working full time at an insurance agency, and then she was a hairstylist, I think, for 3 nights a week at JCPenney.
Yeah.
And we were just doing anything we could just to scrape by. I remember sitting on my front porch, and I was in tears. I told Gwen, how could we have been called out of such a vibrant youth organization, traveling overseas and taking youth overseas and being a part of some amazing things going on, doing volunteer work overseas, and how could we have been suckered almost? How could we have been called out of that and into this? This was terrible. Our youngest son, who was less than a year at the time, he would cry when Gwen would walk out of the room because he didn't know who I was. I was that much of a stranger at home. Mm. So I remember sitting on the front porch just telling her, I think I'm done. I think I'm going to hang up this whole aviation thing and go get a job that you don't have to work 2 jobs as well. I told Gwen, I'm done. We got to get out. We're sinking. And she says, well, let's just take a week and just think about it, pray about it, see what our next steps are. And I want to say it wasn't a couple days later, I got a phone call from another friend of mine at Masaba saying, hey, they're selling the Avro and to a company that does feeder work for Air France. And so they're offering bases in Paris, France, or Dublin, Ireland, where the company was based. They were offering, I think it was 40,000 euro a year after taxes. So they were going to pay our Irish taxes, and then we wouldn't have to pay U.S. taxes because we were out of the country for that long. So 40,000 euro a year, and at that time it was about $1.25 to the euro. So that was 50 grand. And they gave us a house and a car. So I took it. And a lot of guys thought we were nuts. There was only out of the whole Masaba group of 800 pilots, I think there was 12 of us that took it. That was it. Most guys just thought it was too good to be true.
Yeah.
And my 1 year turned into 6 years flying in Europe.
So you packed up the family?
Packed up the family and moved.
How old were your kids at the time?
Dannon, my oldest son, was 7. Jocelyn was 5, and Gabriel was 1.
Wow.
1 year old. In fact, it was Gwen did all that.
Yeah.
She's been through it all. This really isn't, you should be interviewing her, but because this isn't my career. This is our career.
Yeah.
It's this industry can be tough on families, and without the right support there, it's even harder. Yeah. So she was a trooper. I went off to training in August of 2006 and, moved to Ireland, I think the end of August, and she stayed, packed up the house, and moved the kids over to Ireland. So she came and joined me the end of September of 2006.
So you're based out of Dublin?
Yep.
Flying an airplane with the Air France paint scheme?
Yep.
Okay.
Yep.
Flying between European cities?
We did a lot of work out of Paris, Charles de Gaulle, and Orly, both. But then the Avro is really well suited for airports like London City Airport. And we were wanting to do, we didn't know it at the time, but CityJet was planning some major expansion out of London. And London City Airport is really interesting. I could show you some pictures later, but it's built on the old King George V docks in the East End of London. So it'd be a little bit like landing on Ellis Island, or Central Park in New York, where you come right in over the Docklands area, the Canary Wharf, their business district in London, and you point the nose down. Most airports have a 3-degree glide slope. The approach into London City, I think, was 5.5 degrees, almost 6. So you hang it all out there. You get every drag device you can hanging out there, and there's actually lights embedded in the runway, 1,500 foot down the runway. The runway's not very long; it's only 6,000 foot long. And there's lights embedded in the runway. And if your mains aren't on by those lights, it's a mandatory go around. And it was sporty, even because it's you've got so many buildings right around there, but it's built on the old docks. So it's like an aircraft carrier almost. It's totally surrounded by water. But because of where the buildings are, even if it's just 5 to 10 knots of wind, it messes with you.
Yeah.
So there's a couple times where, the mains touched down, but you were floating past the lights and you're like, here I go.
Yeah.
And back up into the sky.
Wow.
So, and there was a couple really hard landings too.
Of course.
You got used to hard landings. The Avro is great for landings because it's got a trailing link landing gear and really it absorbs the landings hard. But my first landing in London City, my in-laws were actually over visiting. We flew them over to Ireland. Over in Europe, at that time, you could, if you had the chief pilot's permission, you could invite family members to come in the cockpit.
Yeah.
And ride around with you. So my father-in-law's in the jump seat for my first London City landing. And of course, you practice this in the simulator. I kissed it on there. It was just perfect, about 400 feet before the lights, just nice and smooth. And my father-in-law's patting me on the shoulder. Well done, son. He was so proud of me.
Yeah.
And we get to the hotel for the debrief, and the training captain says, "It was a pretty smooth landing in the London City." Oh, thanks. Yeah, I am that good.
Right.
And then he says, "Don't you ever do that again. Never. You don't land soft in London City. You plant it on the runway, get the spoilers up, get on the brakes hard, Oh, okay. All right. I know this now for next time." So then the next day, all we had to do was fly up to Edinburgh and then back to London. My father-in-law stayed in the hotel room and he was going to do some touring around in London. Flew up to Edinburgh, then back. And I just planted it on the runway. And this was only about a month or two after Swissair had planted one on the runway, and that made the YouTube channel.
Oh, really?
Oh, yeah, it's still on YouTube. If you look up Swissair hard landing London City, you can see it. And this thing touches. It's actually a great video on showing the logic in the spoiler system because these things are so confused. The spoilers are flopping up and down. The wings are wiggling.
Weight on wheels or not?
Oh, the weight on wheels was so confused. Yeah. And so I just planted on the runway, and I get this image in my mind of that Swissair wing wiggle going on, and I get to chuckling, and Sean, my instructor, says, no, Cory, that was really good. That's what you want. You want a nice firm landing, get it on the ground and get the spoilers up, and that was really good. Oh, okay. All right. I'll try for that more, I guess.
Right.
And at that time, our procedure was the lead flight attendant would call up to the front and say, my doors are disarmed. So the escape slide is disarmed from the door. Am I cleared to open? And I would have to look and see if the stairway was moved up to the aircraft. And I say, yep, you're clear to open your doors. And the aft flight attendants would be listening as well, so they could open the rear doors as well. And she says, Cory, Sophie was her name. She says, my doors are disarmed. Am I clear to open? Yep, Sophie, you can open your doors. Oh, can you call maintenance as well? Why? Because you dropped about 5 rows of masks in the back of the plane, so all the oxygen masks had come down. That's how hard my landing was in London City. So
somewhere between your first landing and that second one was kind of the target that you wanted to.
Yeah. Somewhere between those two.
Gotcha.
Yep. And I don't remember ever having that hard of a landing again in London City, but yeah.
So the economic downturn that we had over here in the U.S., did it kind of feed over there? I mean, because you said that you worked over there for 6 years.
Yeah. Over in Europe, it was about 2 years behind what was going on here in the U.S. So we were already starting to see a lot of things going on in the United States with the housing market crash that we knew was going to affect Europe as well. 2010, things started to really look bleak over there, and CityJet started to downsize a little bit. We started to pull back on some of our routes. And you could see things were starting to get tough. At that time, a number of us were trying to get on with Emirates. So I interviewed with Emirates, and I got a conditional job offer from them. We came back to the United States in June of 2012, June 19th. And I had that conditional job offer from Emirates. So I was told to anticipate a class date sometime around September or October.
Mm-hmm. And Emirates hires a lot of expats.
A lot of expats. Not a tremendous amount of Americans, unless the Americans have been an expat before, had lived overseas. Okay. And then it was in August, Emirates notified me, because the first part of your training is pretty intensive. And so they said, just you come. Don't bring the family right away at the beginning. Yeah. Come, get your villa, get established, get through training, and then invite the family over. So, okay, if I started in September, October, the family would probably come over in November, December timeframe. found out in August that they were delaying classes.
Mm.
And so I probably would expect a class in November, maybe January. They just strung me along. And so I'd take little side contracts. I'd deliver more airplanes. I spent a couple of fabulous months in Libya.
Really?
Yeah.
Doing what?
Yep. It was a couple years after the revolution, a little over a year and a half after the revolution in Libya. And it was for Air Libya. And they had 146s. They also had some Boeing products, but all of their Boeings and most of their 146s were destroyed during the revolution. The company was based in Benghazi, which is where the revolution started. There's video of one of their 146s landing on a road to get out wounded fighters. So I was there after the revolution, but they were starting to really rebuild. The country was rebuilding.
Okay.
And Air Libya was buying Avro RJs. And so they were, same thing. They were flying 146s before. They wanted training on the Avro.
Wow. That's incredible. So you've spent probably the last 10 years of your flying, notwithstanding the last 6 months, but the last 10 years fighting fires.
Yeah.
So how did that opportunity come up then was that for the Forest Service? Was that for a private company?
Private company.
Okay.
And I gotten to know the owner of the company. He was the owner at that time by delivering these aircraft. And these were the airplanes that were going from Europe back to the United States. And actually they started out going to Canada, where he had a partnership with a company to develop a tank system for the Avro. And the Forest Service was wanting to get out of the World War II, Korean War, radial engine propeller airplanes. And they started offering these next generation contracts. They wanted jet aircraft. They wanted a minimum of 3,000 gallons of retardant carried. And what ended up happening, there was a couple of high-profile crashes in 2002. And
these are where the wings fold up. We've all seen those videos of they drop their retardant and wings fold and they overload the aircraft. Or
there was a C-130 that was on video. There's a PB4Y, not a PBY, a PB4Y, which is basically the B-24 with a single tail, not the split boom tail. So there's a 4Y that lost its wing out in Colorado in 2002. And then, of course, the C-130 down on the Nevada-California border lost its wing. That's on video. That created a lot of questions as to what kind of maintenance was or was not being done on these aircraft. And, these airplanes were retired military. They'd been used, well used.
Yeah.
And there was a lot of things that we just didn't know at the time. We couldn't inspect those things as well. And there was a lot of things that just wasn't getting looked at as well. After those high-profile crashes and a bit of bickering back and forth between the FAA, the Forest Service, and the tanker companies, the FAA grounded all air tanker contracts in 2004. In fact, some of our airplanes they were actively working fires. And they got back to the base, the air tanker base, and they got told, go home. Your contract's done. And wait, what? We're in the middle of fighting a fire. Nope. All the contracts are over. Aeroflight was doing scooper contracts, and so that saved the company. And then it was when the next generation contracts came out, that's when Aeroflight started looking at maybe getting back into the federal side of things.
Okay.
So we got initially just 2 contracts for RJ-85s, and they basically took a mod that Conair had developed. They had taken this tank design that had been used on Convairs, Convair 580s, and P3s, and some of these other aircraft. And they'd taken that tank design, kind of stretched it around a belly of a Q400, and sold that tank system to France. And France loved it. They just thought this is a great air tanker, and they could actually remove their tanks almost overnight because of the way the landing gear are out under the wing of a Q400.
Right.
So, because there was the tank design was such a well-proven design, Matt talked Conair into basically sticking it on an Avro RJ-85, same thing, high wing, and sticking it on that on the Avro. We had to wrap it around the landing gear system, so we couldn't remove it overnight.
Yeah,
but it's just a bigger version The Q400 tank holds just over 2,600 gallons, and the RJ85 tank holds 3,000.
What was that flying like for you, coming from airline type flying to now you're low level VFR flying down fire zones? It's got to be an incredible change.
It's a very different style of flying.
Yeah.
Like you said, it's VFR. It's almost all VFR. We would have to do some IFR, but even that there are still air tankers that are flying now that are VFR only, day VFR only.
Yeah.
They can't even fly them at night. And so when you start introducing next generation aircraft with auto land capabilities and stuff like that, auto throttles, it was quite the transition for the air tanker industry as a whole. My involvement was after getting strung on and doing these 1 month contracts, 1 week contracts, just to try and hold on until Emirates came around. I found out in April of that year that they were canceling all future classes.
Emirates was.
Yeah. So that was April of 2013. And by that point, I had delivered a couple more airplanes to Aeroflight. So I called up Matt. I'm desperate at this point. I'm like, Matt, I need a job. Are you still hiring an Avro, pilot? And he says, let me call you back. And okay. He said, I'm in a meeting. I'll call you right back. Okay. 5 minutes later, I get a phone call back. All right, I'm in the meeting with the board. And I said, remember the guy who delivered a couple of airplanes? He needs a job. Should we hire him? And it's unanimous. You're hired. I'll call you back with the details. So that was my getting hired with Aeroflight. And he used to introduce me as the guy who knew everything about the airplane and absolutely nothing about firefighting. And that was accurate.
Yeah.
My idea of fighting fire was based on the movie Always, which is horrible in how you.
I don't think that I've seen that yet.
It's it's a great movie, but
that's
has
actually
nothing to do with it. The actual firefighting in there is not accurate.
That's actually interesting. So, did you have to take some kind of fire study course in terms of how fires burn and how you attack them, or is it more just kind of
even that has
the job training?
It's mostly on the job training. And even that has really evolved over the last 10 years. When I first joined, it was all on the job training. And there is a National Aerial Firefighting Academy, NAFA is what they call it. And it's a joint venture between the Forest Service, BLM, several agencies, CAL FIRE, State of Alaska. There's lots of agencies that have involvement. It's mostly made up of volunteers, both people within the agency, but then also private operators, companies.
The most memorable fire that you flew, what is one that kind of comes to mind?
You always remember the fires that have some sort of trauma.
Yeah.
So I worked a couple fires with an incident within an incident where there's a ground crew that is getting burned over. Those are always hard.
Yeah.
I remember the fires where we were able to help the most. There's one particular fire I worked with in Utah where it was a fast moving grass fire, and there was a buggy that was caught. I think I saw 3 or 4 guys out trying to get this buggy from getting stuck, and I don't even think they could see the fire coming towards them. It was a grass fire, and we were meant to be working a different side of the fire, but we saw them down there, and the fire was starting to come up over the hill. And I turned to my co-pilot, who was new with the company at the time. He was a former lead plane instructor, actually, for the Forest Service. So he was pretty knowledgeable, very knowledgeable in fire behavior and activities. And so I said, hey, I think we should maybe help these guys. And so we came in and we laid some retardant line between their buggy and the fire, and the guys were, they're all excited. And we came back later on, and the buggy was gone. And so they had gotten it unstuck, but you could see our retardant line. We came in and put a V in front of their buggy, and you could see the fire come down, hit that retardant line, go around the buggy.
Really?
And then come back together and keep going.
Wow.
So I remember things like that.
Yeah.
Certain fires that are probably the most destructive, the car fire down in Redding, California. That was a memorable one. I think we were the 3rd tanker to drop on that fire. In fact, one of the lead plane pilots in Redding lost his home on that fire.
Wow.
And and I remember talking to him because he was out there, flying lead plane while we were fighting the fire. And I said, Dave, I heard your house burnt down? He's like, yeah, it burnt down. I said, well, what are you doing here? He said, well, I can't do anything at home. Everything's, we got the horses out, we got the dogs out, we got, the family out. I can't do anything at home. It's just a smoldering mess now. So I might as well be out here doing what I can to fight the fire out here. So he flew the next several days until we could try and get ahead of that fire.
Wow. Did you guys always fly with a lead airplane?
I'll say this: the Forest Service doesn't have its own fleet of tankers. They've dabbled in it a couple times, but it's not the most cost effective. It's actually a little bit cheaper to hire private companies to do that. So most of the air tanker companies are pretty good at having licensed air tanker captains. There's different levels. Let me back up a little bit. There's different levels of approval. So when you first start out, you're an AKC. You're an air tanker co-pilot. And you're a first officer and you're brand new to the fire. You may or may not have taken that NAFA 1 course.
Yeah.
Some companies will do sand tables. So there are tables about as big as this table here, sometimes a little bit bigger. And it's just full of sand. It's a sandbox. And so you got little matchbox cars and you got, red string, red yarn to map out where the fire line's going. And you're playing, you're role playing.
Yeah.
What's happening on the fire. And that's how you start as a co-pilot, learning the fire. And when Matt brought me in, he took a big risk because airline pilots don't tend to do great in aerial firefighting. We get really spoiled in the airlines. We get our crew meals. We get our nice hotels.
Yeah.
We get our structure. And there's not a tremendous amount of structure in the aerial firefighting world. And you're out there washing your own airplane. You got to get the stuff off, the retardant off. So you're scrubbing your own airplane, stuff like that. And so Matt took a big risk on hiring a couple of us airline guys with Avro experience. And his goal was what he told me once was he wanted us guys who knew everything about the airplane, but nothing about fire, to fly with guys who knew a lot about fire and very little about the airplane. And, by cross-training each other, we were going to help each other out. And so started off as an AKC, air tanker co-pilot. And then once you move to the left seat, that starts your Forest Service training for captain.
Okay.
And it can be a 2 to 3 year process. It can be quite long. But now you're an AKP, you're an air tanker pilot. But you need certain things in order to drop on a fire. You have to have a lead plane. You have to have an air attack, which is like a forward air controller in the military. They're flying about 2,500 feet above the fire. They're kind of like an air traffic controller.
Okay.
Working out between the ground firefighters and the aerial assets, what the tactics are, what the objective is, keeping aircraft separated, keeping the helicopters over here, keeping the air tankers over there. So as an AKP, you usually have an instructor in the right seat. But you do have to have some sort of aerial supervision. You can't drop on your own. You can't just work with the folks on the ground.
Gotcha.
But then once you've completed your training, that 2 to 3 years of training, and you've got your AKI now, you're what's called an initial attack captain. And once you have your initial attack captain rating, you can have no supervision whatsoever. In fact, there could be no one even on the ground. You could come across a fire that's burning in the middle of nowhere and you have to figure it out. You're running the fire.
Yeah.
But most of the time, we would have at least we'd be talking with someone on the ground, and working out what their needs are. That's really what the air tanker is there for, is how do we help these guys on the ground?
I see.
These guys and gals that are out there fighting the fire on the ground. So we're talking with them. We're usually talking with whoever's the highest ranking one on the scene at the time, their incident commander. We're talking with them, seeing what their needs are. Sometimes they'll say, hey, we need you to do this for us. Sometimes they'll say, hey, I can't see over that hill.
Right.
So just figure it out and tell me what you did.
Yeah.
I've had that happen a couple times. But then what they try to do is once they know that this fire's needing aerial assets, then they'll order that air attack platform. And so then the air attack comes out. He's, like I said, the air traffic controller on scene. He's talking with the folks on the ground. He or she's talking with the folks on the ground and figuring out what their needs are, and then passing that on to the air tankers when they come in, or the helicopters, whatever. If things are really starting to get busy and you're starting to get a lot of aircraft on scene, or there's significant hazards, certain, visibility is a concern, or there's other hazards, or you're doing wildland urban interface where you've got this fire that started in the rural areas now starting to move its way into community, then you got to get a lead plane on scene.
Yeah.
And so that's when the lead plane comes out there. And sometimes they're on their own. They're a solo lead plane. Sometimes they've got an air attack person in the other seat with them, so they could do both roles as an air attack and a lead plane. But the lead plane is the only one that's allowed to go low level. The air attack platforms are not allowed to go low level. They stay up there at 2,500 feet.
So fire season now goes from
January to December.
Yeah.
And that's even here in the U.S.
Yeah.
And I mentioned before that the Forest Service had 44 air tanker contracts, and those contracts were usually within certain regions. So that air tanker would stay in California, or it'd stay in Arizona and New Mexico, or it would stay in whatever region it was assigned. So typically those regions would only have 2 to 4 months of a fire season. But nationally, Florida and Texas, they can be burning in January.
Mm-hmm.
And, you start out in Florida or Texas in January, and then work your way out, and you get into New Mexico and Arizona in March and April. And then you start working your way up through the Rockies into Colorado. And by July, now you're in Montana and Idaho, and August you're in Oregon, and you might have a little jaunt up in Alaska in June, but then back down, and then you're finishing up the fire season in November and December in California with the Santa Ana winds.
So what kind of schedule is that for you?
When I first started, we didn't have a schedule. You started out the beginning of fire season, which might start in May, it might start in March, and you were with the airplane until the end of fire season, which might be done in October, it might be done on Christmas Day.
So you're gone.
You're gone
For that entire time.
Yep. And our chief pilot at the time, he was the first one that I ever heard of that submitted a schedule of having, and he proposed 2 weeks on, 2 weeks off schedule. And we had the best schedule of all the companies out there, if you ask me. Some companies later went on to having 3 weeks on, 3 weeks off. Some companies would do 12 days on, 6 days off. But on our air tanker side, we did 2 weeks on, 2 weeks off.
Okay.
And that was definitely the best schedule out of all the tanker companies, in my opinion.
Yeah. So over the last 6 months, you've kind of made a change.
Yeah. Got rid of the beard. I still miss my beard.
You had to shave. Talk about just kind of, why the change, why now, and kind of, that whole process.
Yeah. I absolutely loved fighting fire. I really did. I loved the camaraderie of it. I worked with some fantastic pilots, and it's very rewarding, but you're gone away from home a lot, and even with the best schedule that we ever had, 2 weeks on, 2 weeks off, you're away from home a long time. In fact, it was my son, when he was still living at home. I think this was our first or second year of doing a 2 weeks on, 2 weeks off schedule. So I was no longer gone for months at a time. I asked him, I'm like, hey, what do you think of this 2 weeks on, 2 weeks off schedule? It's pretty nice, huh? And he says, yeah, it's all right. What do you mean it's all right? I'm actually home 2 weeks out of the month. This is great. And he says, well, there's a lot of life that happens that I forget about. So I can remember what I did 6 days ago, and today's Tuesday. I can remember what I did last Wednesday, but I can't tell you what I did last Tuesday. It's like once it hits that 7-day mark, I forget about it. So he's like, there's at least a week of every month that you're not a part of our lives here because we just don't remember it. And that was the first time of going, all right. And then we got a little short staffed. So the 2 weeks on, 2 weeks off became 2 weeks on, 1 week off. And I made a lot of mistakes by not saying no enough.
Yeah.
So then you do these mini deployments, And like I said, sometimes it was as short as 2 weeks, but sometimes it was as long as 6 weeks.
Well, and it's as you mentioned, it takes a village, it takes a team.
Yeah.
And I think that you're really blessed to have someone here that's been supportive of you for all of those steps, right?
Yeah. Yep.
And now you guys get to enjoy this.
In fact, I would have quit. Yeah, I was the one sitting on the front porch crying, saying, I'm done. I'm done. She was the one saying, no, let's pray about this. It's really because of her and her support that I'm still here doing this stuff. And, you know, it's very few people could handle their spouse being away for a couple months at a time and still managing everything at home. That's hard. That's really hard in the family. And it's having that support is it can't be, you can't put that into words or value.
Well, you've been very generous with your time for us and for our listeners. We appreciate you coming and sharing this incredible story, this aviation story. Look forward to flying with you for the next 15 years, at least. I don't know. I think I got 19 years left. How many years do you have left?
Well, I think I'm 1 year older than you.
Okay.
So,
okay.
So I got 18 years left.
Yeah.
I get paid now to go travel around and see places.
That's it. That's called living the dream, right?
Yeah.
That's it. All right. Well, thank you so much for your time, for our audience. We certainly do appreciate your story. And thank you, everyone, for listening. Until next time, take care.